Ready when you are.
I am 16, going on 17. I know that I'm naive. Fellows I meet may tell me I'm sweet, and willingly I believe.
Stags, rats, and a dodo. We are 16th going on 17th century, that is, on this 15th edition of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that is full of style and quality, with your hosts, John West,
Jim Hall,
and Matt Needer. Tonight, Death wears many faces, one being a multicoloured robot in cricket gloves. After meeting a homeless actor, Peter Davison faces a big chopper, gets handcuffed, and has his tool burnt to a crisp. Eric Saywood delivers The Visitation.
It's the Italian city where Donald Sutherland chased a homicidal dwarf and Roger Moore went cruising in a hover gondola. What will zany Matt Smith pull out of the bag to top them in 2010's Vampires of Venice?
and make mine a double. Hartnell's desperate to find a publicity-shy chemist, then dresses as a Catholic priest, elopes with a young orphan, and flees the police. Peter Purvis is left in the lurch as we survive the massacre. Hello, thank you for downloading.
Hello.
Hello.
You anything to say? No?
Jim's here as well.
That was rather plaintive. So, we kick off tonight's episode with a 1982 four-parter starring Peter Davison as the Fifth Doctor, The Visitation. Written by Eric Saywood.
Yay! Woo!
Our dear friend Eric Saywood.
His first foot in the door.
And it's actually quite a simple plot, which is why I volunteered to summarise it.
Our listeners will be grateful.
Yeah, basically there's what appears to be a comet which lands or crashes. And see, I made it. I thought it was simple, but then I tried to summarise it. There's a comet which lands in where Heathrow will be built, but it's 1666, and we know it's 1666 for reasons which will become clear in the fullness of time.
Spoilers.
John's pointing his finger angrily at us.
And it lands in 1666, confuses the hell out of a squire. I think we're going to discuss in a bit, and his family, and it's very confusing for them. And then there's robots, and the Doctor and Tegan and Adric and Nyssa arrive and try to work out what these interlopers are, and they encounter this wonderful highwayman thespian called Mace,
Richard Mace,
and it's basically a 17th century knockabout romp. Not with, I think, I mean, I'm perhaps putting a bit more into this. I haven't seen all of this era, but I think of this era as cheap studio bound, and this seems to have a lot more what's the word?
Location work?
Yeah, this seems to have a lot more location work.
Even the studio work, I mean, that was the thing that first
the barns and what have you are really...
Yeah, well, and also the house. I mean...
The scale as well, the barn is really...
It's not a cold opening as such, but that opening sequence where the comet arrives and then so the aliens who arrive as part of the comet crashing down are the pteroleptils, and a pteroleptil gets into the house at the Squire. And that opening sequence with all the tracking shots, but also the really luscious interiors and the really nice period costumes. I mean, yeah, for an era which, I too associate with looking incredibly cheap. It looks fantastic.
It really does.
And the location works really good, but also the period setting really brings out the best in the studio and the design work. I think it's full of lovely little design flourishes that work really well. So yeah, interesting you picked up on that, because that was the first thing that struck me. It's like, oh, this looks great.
It does look good.
And even at the end, there's more studio work but done on film, isn't there?
Oh, for the
sequence when they're in.
Yes.
So we'll give it away.
Well,
when they're at
let's do
Pudding
this
Lane at the end to accidentally start the Great Fire of London. Yeah, that looks great, I thought, the film.
Well, shall we start with that bit of arseholery then? The fact that it's the Doctor who starts the Great Fire of London.
Yeah.
What do we like this kind of thing, or do we think
It put a big smile on my face when I was 10.
Yeah.
Now I find it a bit tedious.
Can I say, Jim?
Yep.
At the age of 33, it put a big smile on my face.
Was this a surprise to you?
Yeah, I hadn't. I mean,
Oh, okay.
Well, just to back up a little, I'm getting the impression from your tone that you really enjoyed this. Did
I
you
really
did you
enjoyed
like
this.
Well,
I really liked
John's
it.
got
This is
a lot
a
of
first for
time.
you with Davison, isn't it? That's,
it's the first for me with Davison. Although again, it's not really so much. There were a couple of things. Well, let me finish this thought. As soon as they arrived in London,
Was this a surprise to you, by the way, the end?
Yeah, it was.
You hadn't read it before?
No, I deliberately don't.
I imagine that would be quite satisfying.
Well, ever since the Coquillian nonsense in
The Rescue.
I've deliberately avoided seeing any synopsis nonsense.
And you've seen The Force Awakens.
Yes, I've seen
The Crying Game?
I've not seen The Usual Suspects. I've not seen The Usual Suspects. No, anyway, so I hadn't read ahead. I hadn't read ahead on any synopsis or anything. And when it came to it, and they arrived in London, and then there was a beautiful bit where, and of course, to like the way the Doctor carries a torch, and I thought, oh my god! So I absolutely adored it. I thought it was great, and I loved this sort of wow 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 burning Pudding Lane at the end. I thought it was gorgeous. But,
although the bum note that was slightly struck by, so seeing as we are discussing the ending first, I made a note of obviously there's the moment where it's the reveal, and you kind of, if you've got a slight sense of history, you kind of see it coming. But it's the slightly... Well, you're the one who's got a history degree in this room, mate. It's when the Doctor sort of very smugly says, it's at the end, he says, I'll explain someday, and then he says, this fire should be allowed to run its course, like really satisfied, like he's played a part in something that still killed an awful lot of people. And
no, it didn't.
Eliminated the plague. Oh, did it not?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, the Great Fire of London had an astonishingly low number of casualties.
Oh, okay.
Now, that's really...
And it ended the plague?
Genuinely quite...
Or is that bullshit as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But...
turns out I don't know much about the Great Fire of London.
To be fair, I did think the Great Fire of London would play a part as soon as there were... as soon as it was clear that they were going to use some sort of version of the plague and the rats, it seemed like the best way to deal with them would be to burn them all, and because that's what you do with rats, right?
Yeah, of course.
And a big fire. But I didn't think it would be the Doctor that started it.
Yeah.
That was what I liked. Oh. That was superb.
So you enjoyed this?
Yeah, I really did. I thought it was it reminded me a lot of The Mask of Mandragora in terms of the sort of really nice use or blend of studio work with location filming. There's even a horse.
Yeah.
Nice
high production values.
High production values, great costumes. It's nicely directed by Peter Moffat.
Wow, those words don't go together very well.
Really?
No, not many people have...
It's not known as a good director.
Well, I wonder, maybe it's in the editing or something.
I'll come on to him later.
Maybe we can unpick... Jim, maybe you will know why this seems to...
Do you like this one, Jim? Sorry.
Like I say, I saw this when it came out when I was about 10, and I think by the end of that first Peter Davison season, I was looking back on this as probably the best one. I wasn't wildly enthused, but it felt the most Doctor Who-ish. It kind of adhered to what you'd expect Doctor Who to do, and maybe some of the others were disappointing to me at that age. Watching it now, not just this time, but the last several times I've seen it, yeah, you're looking at more as, wow, this is what got Eric Sayward on board.
Yeah.
And even though I agree with a lot of what John said, or I'm inferring it's a traditional Doctor Who story.
Yeah.
It does a lot of what you want it to do.
Bit of Pertwee, bit of... Yeah,
I mean, and you may have heard
it's
this.
Very Tom Baker in places.
Yeah,
it's very mid-period Tom Baker.
The mythos with this is Sayward had written a few radio dramas. He was approached to do something for Doctor Who and just wasn't familiar with the show. He'd caught bits of it. Apparently his girlfriend said, oh, well, there was this one I saw, and she pretty much recounted The Time Warrior, which is one of John Pertwee's last stories. Yeah. And you can see parallels there. It's still something crashes
Same
to Earth
story.
in history.
It's an alien crashes in the past.
Exactly.
And
it hits those beats. Now I find it kind of underdeveloped. I mean, the main thing is, as lovely as Michael Robbins is, as Richard Mace, this thespian highwayman.
We'll have a proper discussion.
We'll have a proper discussion on him. He's pretty much the entirety of the 17th century characters in this. There are other speaking roles, but they're just the
him and the pteroleptal leader are
He's not really a local, though, is he?
No, he's the only local, but they are the only supporting characters.
But given you said it in history, it would be nice to get a sense of it.
Yes.
And I think we all really enjoyed that opening, which I think Sayward on the DVD extras for this calls
I don't know.
Grab.
I thought the Toothless Simpletons were quite good.
But again, you're not getting a sense of the world there, are you? They're just their local colour. It would have been nice to have actually had...
Local colour.
Yes, it would have been nice to have had a bit more going on with that, rather than just this one representative.
I suppose that's the thing. I mean,
He is quite overpowering, though, I suppose.
I think I probably agree with Jim on this, but with hints of John's enthusiasm in that this is a period of Doctor Who that
You're the Derek Smalls of
I am
discussion.
of the lukewarm water of this discussion. But I'm so used now to being disappointed badly or bored or irritated by this era of Doctor Who when it comes round, and by this era I mean the 80s when it comes around on this podcast. I thought this was fun and very enjoyable, with a lot of individual points of merit to commend it. But I think it's very much like snack Doctor Who. I think it's like I don't think there's a huge amount of meat on the bones, and I think there's an awful lot of stuff that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. I think it barely sort of fills up its 4 episodes with enough going on in order to sort of engage you. But it's pretty good fun.
What I wanted to add, though, I think it's fair to say we've been highly critical of Eric Sayward, and
yep.
we
will be again.
We will be again. But I mean, Eric Sayward obviously is the writer. There is a script editor, and having watched some of Eric Sayward's self-edited scripts, one assumes that there's a degree of polish here, but
it's also fairly atypical of the stuff that Sayward later serves up.
Yeah. In terms of just being grim.
Well, we've got great dialogue like "You must think me a fool" and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well,
but I think Anthony Root, who was the editor,
yeah.
was demob happy at this point. He wasn't there for very long. So
but also the kind of Sayward-ese dialogue, you kind of get away with it a bit more by putting it in the mouth mainly of Richard Mace.
And an animatronic reptile.
In that they are both very stylised characters.
Yeah.
The idea that none of these people are ordinary people, quote unquote. Sorry, John, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. No, I agree with all of that. So where the Saywardisms sort of come through, as you say, because they're channeled into really just 2 stylized characters, then that kind of works. But what I actually really took away from this, because I know I seem very enthusiastic about this, I come down more on Matt's side, which is I was so waiting to be. I have disliked everything
Expecting
from this,
to hate it, yeah.
and it was actually pacey and fun and well produced. And although it was
3 things one rarely associates with 80s Doctor.
Yeah, and although I agree, it is slight, it is not in the top tier, I enjoyed it, and I thought it was good. What I did think was interesting was the bits that didn't really work were, again, the 4-handed TARDIS team.
Oh my God, they are woeful.
And you come to realise, in Eric Sayward's defence, that this is a lot of John Nathan Turner's nonsense rather than Sayward's, because it's him who's built this stupid team.
Well, and this is something that I think we've picked up on with various other stories, other Davison stories that we've talked about, is that one of the first things that the script always tries to do in a Davison story is to pair the Doctor off with a far more charismatic character, whether it's, like, who was it in Terminus, like Liza Goddard or someone?
Yes.
And then
Neris Hughes.
And Neris Hughes in Kinder and all those people.
And not Rulon. Oh, well, Rodney Bewes.
Rodney Bewes, yes, of course. Lest we forget. Hungry Rodney Bewes. Here it's very much Richard Mace, and the Doctor. The story is basically the Doctor and Richard Mace kind of investigate this thing, whilst the rest of the TARDIS crew sort of hang around,
hypnotised, run around,
tied up,
build something in the TARDIS,
build a big vibrator in the bedroom.
Yes,
indeed.
etc. In fairness, I did hear recently on another podcast, I think, that Adric was meant to go a lot sooner, or Nyssa wasn't expected to stay on, or something, and it was kind of a bit of an administrative error that there were that many characters around. But yeah, I mean, it is weird.
Administrative.
Well, yeah, but it is weirdly noticeable, isn't it?
Was this an early 80s job creation scheme?
Very much, yeah. YTS script editor. But yeah, Richard Mace, who you wanted to talk about a little bit more. I mean, even though I can completely buy the story that Sayward was building his script around something his girlfriend remembered, and it works.
Richard Mace was a pre-existing character.
He was a pre-existing
wasn't he, from a Sayward radio series
from a few radio plays he'd done, which had been relatively successful. The weird thing is, later Sayward gets a kicking for being a bit too respectful of Robert Holmes. And Richard Mace seems totally out of Robert Holmes, especially given we only did the Rebus operation on the last show. And he's very much in the mould of...
He's another Garen, isn't he?
Yeah.
I think he's better than Garen.
Oh, I much prefer him to that, yes.
Yeah,
he's a likeable character, and you like he's open about his cowardice and stuff.
You see, the thing is,
I loved the performance, and I loved the dialogue. When they go into the empty house, and he's he's barely trying to hide the fact that he's trying to half-inch everything. And I think it's Tegan says something, or it's a bit scary, or it's a bit weird, or something. And he's just out of nowhere says, "I find this house full of style and quality." It's just
great.
amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just out of nowhere.
I found Richard Mace like massively on diminishing returns with this. In that, like in episode 1, I thought, oh, he's great, and I've written down Mace is such a fun character. But I think the problem is, and it comes back to what Jim was saying earlier, there are so few characters in this that, you know, the idea of him being the sort of comic, roguish character, the sort of Garon-style character, is that, you know, with the absolutely nothing TARDIS crew, he only really has Peter Davison to play off. And so it becomes very, very one-note, I think. So... you know, I was loving Richard Mace in part 1. I was sort of thinking, okay, so it's wearing a little bit thin by part 2. By part 3, I was kind of like, oh, shoot me, you know, because there's so little. It's just the same thing again and again and again. And I think if he was given, you know, if there were any other characters which would maybe just slightly decentralise his performance, but I don't think he's enough to support the entire.
And he doesn't really develop, does he? He doesn't develop much from when we first see him, other than he starts to believe something about this sort of stuff from other worlds.
But who cares? He's just if the one note is a high C. Then...
No, absolutely. And you know what? He's a darn sight more engaging. I mean, so let's talk about the regulars for a bit, you know, if we have to, because I mean they just suck the life out of everything. I mean, after that super pacey opening, you know, scene with the Squire's house where it all gets
with Fred Elliott
Savadent as the Squire, who wasn't. There's all that stuff about whether he'd drunk enough. What was he drinking at the beginning?
Has this gone through the legal? Have we legaled this?
Oh no, the character's drinking, not the character.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes, you know, because the son's berating him for drinking too much. No, I'm not making any.
There's some mention of gout, isn't there?
I'm not making any claims about John Savadent at this point. At this point, you know. But yeah, I mean, that's such a great opening. And then just like the pace just crashes down as soon as you're in the TARDIS crew with these, frankly, bunch of horrible people, of whom I'm including the Doctor as one of them, who just clearly really dislike each other. You know, and...
Although then you immediately get Tegan sort of welling up saying, "Oh, I've not always been the best of companions, but I'm going to miss you," because she thinks she's going to be getting off in Heathrow at any moment. I mean, I think we know these companions aren't good. Maybe one or two of them would have worked, but certainly not all three.
No, but I read up on the Philip Sandifer blog on this last night, as I quite often do, and he picked up on the Robert Holmes thing that you mentioned as well. But the best thing that I liked about his article on it was in the comments underneath. There's one guy who said, a friend of mine once made a re-edit of the Visitation that was just the scenes of Nyssa hanging around in the TARDIS. She said added up to about 10 minutes and was Brechtian in its absolute bleakness. And you do realise that for and actually, you know, the direction something we'll come on to in a bit, because I think it's especially for Peter Moffat, who is not terribly
he's not got a good rep.
He's not got a good rep. I think this is pretty well directed, with a few interesting caveats and decisions which we'll discuss. But there are some scenes, I mean, those interminable scenes quite often of Nyssa hanging around in the TARDIS, and including just like a very slow sequence where we see her very slowly drag a large battery from the console room through to her bedroom.
Yeah, I was watching that last night.
It's just like, and you see the full length of her getting it from room to room.
The shot lingered rather, I thought.
Oh,
not in a very exciting way, though. I don't think.
We're not looking down her top on this one. She's not like Terminus.
It's
she's
more
wearing
her pert box posterior that you're.
I see.
Or do you subscribe to Birds and Batteries?
John's well into batteries. So can we talk about? I've made a huge point here, and I put a big asterisk by it. Can we talk about Nyssa's bedroom? In the TARDIS, because we spend quite a lot of time in Nyssa's bedroom, and the design distinctions that they've made, where someone has obviously thought, what does a girl's bedroom on this TARDIS look like? So she has the bed with throw and some cushions and things.
On the brass bedstead, isn't it? I seem to.
Yeah, brass bedstead. Yeah. Next to the bed, there is a dresser. Which has a metal peacock on it, like a brass peacock. And then there's the dresser at the end of the bed, which has got all these kind of ornamental pots, like these quite chintzy, like ornamental pots on it. And then next to her bed, there is her clothing rail, which has hanging on it her one other costume that we see during this period of it.
Is that her fairy skirt? From
yes,
earlier?
But it's the fairy skirt hanging on there.
Because Black Orchid hasn't come on yet, has it?
No.
She's not got her...
no, she's not gone to the blue...
Her fancy dress blue outfit.
Cami top, no. And then a horrible rubber plant, although much like the one I'm sitting behind. So, and that's the decision that they do. However, someone has obviously thought this through, and there's a couple of like little directorial things which I find really unintentionally funny in this. When she gets the big vibrator going to destroy the robot,
the bling bot,
she has taken all of the ornamental pots off the dresser, so the dresser's empty. So we did get the sequence where she pulls the battery from room to room, but we don't get the different sequence where she takes everything off the dresser in case it gets...
Because I think... Do they show some things kind of juddering along to show that the vibration...
No, they just move the camera around a bit.
There's that... Oh, I thought there definitely was a sequence of something juddering along to show that's what's happening. I like the fact she just wears ear defenders to protect herself from this thing that can shake a big metal robot to pieces.
There's these weird little touches where, like... So it's things like that where the direction... There's obviously a bit of care taken over it, but it's focused on the oddest things. Like the scene where the android then comes into the TARDIS, takes off the death mask and very carefully places it on the console so that just to make sure that it's safe. So
he's like Dennis Hopper at the end of Blue Velvet. When he's,
so he can pick it up on the way out. And there's these very sort of odd little decisions, mate.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd that you noticed all of those bits in the background. The thing I noticed in the background was, as good as a lot of this is, and obviously you can't expect them to go too far budget-wise, but there's one scene with the miller doing his business. The miller and his pals in a barn, and they're all getting very het up. And if you look, there's a stuffed donkey in the background, which I couldn't keep my eyes off. And I'm hoping it's the same one that they used to use in the Goodies title sequence with Bill Oddie.
I did like when the Doctor and Mace arrived at the miller's barn, and out of nowhere, Mace caresses the horse and says, "The object of my desire."
Absolutely.
It's just, and I thought it was wonderful. I just thought some of these little dialogue flourishes were really good. I mean, there's actually a good joke from Adric where they arrive at the house and the Doctor goes round the corner and Mace says, "What
do we do if someone answers?
What do we do? What do we say if the door is opened?" And Adric just says, "Hello?" I actually laughed. I thought that was pretty good.
There's a couple of good bits, but actually with the jokes in it, there's also, I made a note that there's a number of bits which is someone cracks a joke and then someone else responds really angrily to it. If you're going for this sort of lightly jokey comic tone, I think it's all right just to have a joke in it. But there's bits where the Doctor says to Tegan, "How are you feeling?" And she says, "Oh, groggy, bad-tempered." And the Doctor says, "Oh, almost your old self." Which, you know, if anyone with a sense of comic timing would have left it there. But then Tegan goes, "That's not funny. You don't know what I've been through." Or something. It's like, no, just leave it there. It happens again then when, like, they go in and into the house and Tegan says, "Well, I don't think they'll have left a forwarding address." You know, again, not a bad joke. But then the Doctor turns around and goes, "Will you?" As if he's about to lay her out. It's like...
Oh, man.
Can we get to the nub of why... We're none of us saying that it's classic Doctor Who, but we're all agreed that some planets...
The bar's been set quite low by some of the other Davisons we've set.
But the stars are aligned or whatever. To a certain degree, it's competent, it's fun to watch, it's a bit pacey. The dialogue, whether it was great to begin with, it's been polished, whatever, it's been through the mangle and come out as watchable, pretty interesting. What has aligned here? Why does this work when other things around it haven't, with pretty much the same personnel?
Well, I think it's working to, and as Jim points out, it's taking the Time Warrior as a template, and so it's a good setup. It's not overcomplicating the story, but there's lots of nice twists and revelations along the way. It doesn't suffer from that sort of episode 3 syndrome where everyone's just running on the spot in order just to further the plot to get to the finale. I think it's a very easy watch simply because it's very nice to look at. And that, in this day and age, that counts for a huge amount, that it's not frustrating to watch.
Certainly in comparison to the other Davisons we've looked at and ones we haven't looked at yet. But yeah, looking at, like I say, when this season was finished, I remember thinking this was probably the best one. And You can see, compared to something like Castrovalva, which is this kind of mathematical riddle, and there's all sorts of other stuff wrong with it. Much as we love Kinder, well, two of us,
So that 3 ain't bad.
a bit smart-assed. This just seemed very traditional. It wasn't full of continuity, and it wasn't like later Saywood scripts full of gore and military hard men. It's just a breezy kind of, I don't want to say romp, but kind of.
Well,
Michael Robbins is very charismatic.
I agree with all of that, but I do think it is interesting that we've almost come to the end of the time that we've allotted to speak about this one, and yet we still again haven't really talked about the central character. Like, again, we're talking about Davison's a Davison story where we don't really mention Davison. I know, Jim, you quite like him, and I suspect there's a degree of perhaps childhood affection for him because he was your or one of your doctors of growing up. But I just think of him as very slight. The interesting thing in this one is that he's portrayed that bit grumpier, I think, throughout the serial than he actually generally is.
A lot of the dialogue feels very Tom Baker-ish in terms of just that sort of slightly gruff, kind of dismissive, and that was something that actually we picked up on in Kinder as well, is that they're writing him as, I think they are writing him as quite sort of cold and quite opinionated as well. He obviously favours Nyssa. He's frustrated by Tegan, and he's deeply irritated by Adric all the time. But yeah, I mean, I think they're just, there is some, I think, and perhaps it's a bit like when we're going to come on to talk about another relatively early Matt Smith. I think it's when they're not necessarily writing to the performance. So they write a much colder, more Tom Baker-ish Doctor in his first year. And there's sort of a very interesting and productive friction between how they write it and what he does with the performance. Yeah. Whereas in later years, once you establish that the Fifth Doctor is played by a nice bloke, they write a nice bloke.
I think this is early in Davison's run, judging by the length of his hair. That's famously how you can tell what's going on.
Barometer of what order they shot things in.
Yeah. I'm a fan of Davison. I think part of it is, even though I now love Tom Baker's last season, I remember as a child thinking, I'm kind of waiting for him to go now. He clearly isn't enjoying doing this anymore. So there's kind of a freshness with Davison, and not to preempt what we're going to talk about with Vampires of Venice, but even watching that, there's a sense of, it's the new Doctor. There's a certain amount of fun with that. Before we wrap up, we've not really talked about Michael Mellier as the pterodactyl.
Yes, that was
You've
exactly
got your fist in the air. He's a very erudite
I think
villain.
He's great. And I think
it's a terrific performance through that mask, and I'm not dissing the mask.
I think it's a pretty... I like the design.
Yeah, and there's the gills thing that move independently. There's a lot of work that's gone into it.
It's been thought through.
But
there's
it's
a few
just
nice bit of animatronics, like the way his upper lip curls when he's a little bit angry.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good mask, but to get such a lovely performance through that mask, I think is really something.
Well, because I like, and we talked about this when we watched The Leisure Hive. Now, The Leisure Hive does it very, very deliberately. They take on a voice changer which has that pre-programmed, the wonderful Fomasi voice, which I adore. I think it's a really smart decision. And here, this has just been, there's no suggestion as to why there is such a sort of erudite, slightly urbane kind of pteroleptal leader. But I like that. I like the sense. I always like it when like a big silly rubber kipper thing that's wandering around, has a cool plummy actor voice. I think that's it would have been boring.
Plummy, but his dialogue's certainly quite cod Shakespearean, which is something else Saywood gets picked up on.
Yeah, but again, I think it works here. I think Michael Mellier, I think he commits to the part. But also, I like, it would have been so easy for them to say, oh, well, he's an alien, so we'll put his voice through a wobbly thing to make him sound, like they do with every alien voice on the new series. Whereas actually, it's just an actor performing through a big, stupid rubber fish mask. I rather like it.
I'm less of a fan of the actual design. I think even as a kid, I thought you can see where it's kind of a jerkin and he's got a weird cape made of scales. All this kind of stuff.
Although then the bit where he's riding into, he's getting a horse and they put the black cape on him with the hood and everything, and I think that looks brilliant. That's one of us. There's a really nice design moment.
But I find it odd because at the end he meets up with his two pteroleptal pals, and you just think that must have been a lot of money, a chunk of the budget to produce
They're all different coloured as well, aren't they?
Well, that's not such a big deal. It's a nice conceit. It probably kind of reflects the android with all its different colours. But you just think that must have been a big chunk of money which could have gone elsewhere, maybe, given they're only in it for like one scene, aren't
then
they?
also the effects, and if we're looking for traits of Sayward grisliness in this, just when the fire's starting off, the quite lingering shots of the pteroleptal faces all melting
away,
and like literally
and bubbling away,
boiling up, and
Yeah.
it's good, but it's like it's quite strong for
But
what is quite a frothy.
I quite liked it because it was an isolated payoff rather than 4 episodes of grim violence.
it's a grisly death for the main villain as opposed to...
And it was also quite funny because, I mean, I know it's... you see the face
bubbles up
burn,
and
but
pops.
it bubbles up and pops, and you can imagine kids going, ugh.
it's
in a
kind
really
of icky.
Exactly.
I've just read Matthew Waterhouse's autobiography, Blue
Yes.
Box
This is
Boy.
the one that's written in the third person, isn't it?
It's one of a few autobiographies I've read written in the third person.
By Matthew Waterhouse.
But he's quite big on Michael Robbins. That's most of his memory of doing this particular story. And
Most of my memory of watching it, to be
picture
fair.
he paints of him is just a man who's obsessed with doing charity events and making everyone very aware of the fact that he does charity events. And he's very much sounding out Matthew Waterhouse, saying, "Yeah, I'll do these for nothings," as he likes to call them. So, and it's terrible when actors want to get paid afterwards. And one man asked me to pay him, and I paid out every pound note individually to And he's sending out Matthew Waterhouse, but then he's very much, do you think Davison, do you think he'll do what? Do you think he's going to do for nothing for me? Mace is my favourite thing about this, definitely.
Yeah. Well, he contributes to the air of fun, really, and that's the thing. I mean, Resurrection of the Daleks was not fun, and this was, so...
Tegan found it had stopped being fun.
At this point, it's still fun.
At this point, it's still fun.
You're a carefully understated performance.
Yes.
Well, he's a thespian.
One of
he is
the
a
subtle performances.
He's a thespian. Oh, poor Eric Sayward used to scream every time he opened his mouth. I know he was a little bit lax with the lines, but I mean...
Well, it was a little bit, never mind.
No, I
Apparently, what Matthew tell us what he...
Yeah,
tell
no,
us
Michael, he thought this was the worst job he'd ever done, and he complained about it. He was sitting around saying it's the worst job. I've been an actor for 40 years, the worst job I've ever done. It's a load of old rubbish. This was a man who had been on the buses for 20 years and thought Doctor Who was the worst thing he'd ever been in.
So for our next story tonight, depending on which way you look at it, we're either going forward in time to 2010 or we're going back in time to 1580. 1580, thank you very much, John. With Vampires of Venice, which is the 6th episode from Doctor Who's 5th season, new series 5th season, Matt Smith's first series as the Doctor. And we pick up where we left off with the Matt Smith era, actually. It follows on directly from the controversial ending, shall we say, to Flesh and Stone, where Amy tries to jump the Doctor in her bedroom.
Rather than jump the shark.
Yeah. well, whether the show was doing that, that's a separate discussion. So the Doctor, somewhat concerned by this turn of events and the fact that travelling with the Doctor might be warping her sensibilities, the Doctor decides to intervene and takes her and her fiancé Rory, hot from his stag do, back to Venice in 1580 for a romantic holiday. But when they get there, they discover there is a coven of vampires operating in Venice, kidnapping local girls, all under the control of... What's her name? Is it...
Helen McCrory.
Yeah, Helen McCrory, but what's the character's name?
As
Rosanna?
Signora...
yeah, it's Rosanna, isn't it?
Calveri
Yes.
or something.
So
Rosanna.
You can tell we love this story.
A wealthy Venetian patron who takes girls into her school and turns them into vampires, and then all sorts of shenanigans ensue. Actually, I'm going to start with this one.
Please.
Good for you.
Yeah, and then you can pick on the bones. I mean, as we've probably made clear right now, none of us are particular fans of the Matt Smith era of Doctor Who. I had completely forgotten that I had actually viewed this episode first time around when it went out. I mean, on recollection, I did watch it when it went out, but it was almost like I was watching a completely new episode, like I'd forgotten pretty much everything about it. So it was almost like I was watching it afresh last night. My take on this is that there are a few interesting things about it and a few things that it does well, and there are a couple of things that it does very well. But on the whole, I think this is incredibly slight and unmemorable. I think once you dig into what it's trying to do, there's potentially a little more meat on the bones. But I think it's a very insubstantial episode, made more so by the fact that reading around a little on it, the idea was that as the 6 episodes of this season, it was meant to sort of act as a mid-series jumping on point for new viewers, in the way that the 6th episode of the Christopher Eccleston season, the Dalek episode, was designed to be like, well, if you've not been watching so far, you can jump on now.
Yeah, it's usually a bit of a pizzazz episode with absolutely. A big monster coming back or something.
But this was very much intended to be, if you've not been watching Series 5 up until this point, this would be a good place for you to start and pick up the ongoing threads of the story. But I think there are a few aspects of this which are likeable, and a few interesting things to say, but I'm assuming that neither of you enjoyed this very much.
Well, there were a few interesting things. Go ahead.
I was going to completely agree with Matt, actually. I think it's...
But you couldn't remember watching it first time.
No, but
I remember watching it this time. Yeah.
It is very slight. It reminded me, actually, of when we reviewed The Crimson Horror, in terms of it being relatively competent.
I think this is better than the Crimson Horror. But
I do as well. I do definitely think it's better, but it reminded me of the way that it's competent and colourful, and there's action. And
I mean, actually, rather like the Visitation. I wasn't bored by it as such, but it didn't really touch the sides.
And I think there are a couple of really great performances in it. I think Matt Smith. Again, this is my take. I don't like the era, but I like him, and I like him particularly in season 5. I like him in his first season. He arrives, and I think it's
a weird kind of smouldering thing that he's doing at this point,
especially with Helen McCrory.
Yes,
he's totally unsexual with Amy.
And River Song.
Yeah.
But absolutely sizzles with Helen McCrory.
Helen McCrory, I mean...
Although she's the other standout performer.
Yeah, absolutely.
She's terrific.
She's brilliant in this.
But then she's good in everything.
Those scenes where it's the two of them kind of squaring off against each other. Yes,
very much like Anthony Head in School Reunion, but sexy.
Well, yeah. No,
I don't know. I think a lot of people would think Anthony Stewart Give Me Head is pretty sexy. It's the second time in as many months I've made.
Okay, I'm going to put a little asterisk by that comment, Jim, because I think that's very interesting and something I want to come back to. But before we get to that, what did you make of this, Jim?
The standout thing for this, for me, Helen McCrory's great. The thing I really liked, which I've maybe taken for granted, and it is weird when you're then watching a 1982 adventure and a reconstruction, as we'll come on to. I think the location stuff looks fantastic in this.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
Is it Croatia they filmed it?
Yeah, they shot it in Croatia. But you're right. I mean, the location work is terrific, and the direction, I think, kind of makes the most of it as well. It's not... Yeah,
there's plenty to admire, and given...
Without ever really being too showy either. I mean, it's like there's never any sort of... There's not too many
thousands
of
those
gondolieri
going by.
Yes, there's not too many sort of quote-unquote iconic shots to say, oh my God, we're in Venice kind of thing. But... It looks beautiful.
And having been to Venice, it did convey the sense of being in Venice, and I agree that it was really nice they did that without doing any sort of cliched shots of them running around St. Mark's. Obviously they didn't go to Venice, but trying to do that kind of thing. In some ways, I think Daleks in Manhattan really fell down by doing sort of one shot of the Empire State Building, and then
it never once felt like they were in New York.
Whereas
Daleks
this does feel like they're in Venice. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
But the other thing for me, all right, we've already said Matt Smith in his first season is probably an early episode for him. Yeah, there's still something original and fresh about him here. Even though I remember watching, I think one of the first clips I saw from this season was from this episode. It's when he meets the girls, the Vestal
Virgins. That was the clip that they used on the Jonathan Ross show.
And
when
you can't see the reflection, and he's doing all of his bit of business when he's looking a bit confused, and you can see the wheels turning, and shows his library card of William Hartnell. And I did just think, I probably have some drama in this as well as just wackiness. And it's kind of, I know it's a little hard to justify. My big problem has always been with this. I'm going to kind of glibly say...
Have you watched this much since it went out?
No, I maybe watched it once or twice when it was on, and then this is the first time in several years.
6 years, yeah.
If your episode's called Vampires of Venice...
Yes.
And Doctor has a precedent of vampires, albeit alien vampires, but they were ostensibly the vampires of myth.
Yeah.
This is Fishmen with a rain machine, and it
Yes.
can't help but feel a bit of a letdown. Now, I know someone could counter that and say, but in the demons or something, they're not really demons, they're aliens or whatever. But
Yeah.
this just feels like, why not just have them as vampires? That would have been it feels like they're trying to Scooby-Doo their way out of it, but to no effect.
I'm not
They're
entirely
doing something less
I'm not
interesting than
entirely
what's been
sure I
promised.
agree, because, obviously, especially being especially in like European law, the vampire, is a very rich culture. I mean, sort of more Eastern Europe, but that's quite a rich theme. But I don't know. I mean, that was sort of another aspect of it that I quite enjoyed, was the sort of explaining away of how, the contrivances that this race of fish people had to make gave rise to vampire legend, and why you can't see their reflections. I thought that was quite fun. I mean, it's quite knowing. It's quite a knowing wink to the audience.
What I loved
saying
about
all
that
the
is
Hammer horror tropes that
Well, what I love about that is of course that it's nonsense, and yet it's a nonsense rationalisation of myth.
Yeah,
and therefore
rather than
I found
supernatural
that quite fun.
bullshit, it's science fiction bullshit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I
But
thought it was quite good fun.
I actually don't think the fish people look that great as the
No,
CGI.
it's quite
And-
spotty CGI.
And again,
at
it
this
would have
point.
been better to have just had them as people with big. The teeth look good.
Yes.
And I don't mean that lightly. I think that can often be a
it's very
make or break thing.
well,
with
and
vampires.
that's actually this series. This series did run into budget problems. It's been quite well documented. And one of the things that there is quite to an extent that they massively sort out in the following couple of years. But a lot of the CGI is quite spotty in this season. Like Prisoner Zero, I seem to remember in the 11th hour looking particularly bad.
Yeah.
But then that said, I quite like the design of the fish people in quite a cartoony way. But no, I want to return to an asterisk point that the point that I asterisked earlier about the sparring between Rosanna and the Doctor as being very similar to Anthony Head.
Which is, again,
Tennant.
we've lost air people in.
Yeah. So we reviewed School Reunion last month, and this is the second episode, so the big return to Doctor Who of Toby Whithouse, the writer of School Reunion, who has also gone on to do Being Human, which I love. I think that's an absolutely terrific show. He was the showrunner on that, and he comes back to Doctor Who to do Vampires of Venice. And he is doing an episode here which is designed, and this is one of the things that I don't think really comes across, and one of my many frustrations of this era is that there's potentially interesting avenues that they can go down, particularly in a character route, but never quite come off. In that this episode is explicitly designed to do almost exactly the same thing as School Reunion, in terms of throwing into question exactly the nature of how transient and how life-changing the Doctor's relationship with his assistant is, and then also to bring in that tertiary character slightly more into the fold. So in School Reunion, it's Mickey, who is drawn much more closely into the TARDIS crew. Here, it's Rory.
Yeah. Mickey very much an ex-boyfriend at that point.
Yeah, is he officially, formally? I'm not sure if he is. I don't think Rose and Mickey ever formally split. I mean, their relationship is obviously a bit.
I think we've already had Boomtown at that point. Well, we have.
Yeah.
I remember the dialogue in that seems to suggest they both. Well, Mickey's moved on a bit.
Oh,
or
yeah,
tried to.
no, that's right. He's been seeing a few other people. But it's very much about, for the audience, at least, attempting to sort of rehabilitate the goofy boyfriend character of the assistant, who obviously then is far more seduced by a life of adventure with the Doctor versus the slightly mundane bloke they leave at home. But this is about, bringing the mundane bloke they leave at home back into it. And I almost wish that they'd kind of... I mean, that's obviously what the episode is designed to be about, the vampires of the kind of tertiary thing to that character story. But as with a lot of stories of this era, it kind of fudges those key character beats, and it's a lot less interesting than I think it could potentially be. I think one thing that is particularly interesting here is that the Doctor, from the outset, is explicitly taking Rory's side on this. And it's almost like an unspoken thing, is that he's recognised what happened between Rose and Mickey and how Rose was very much changed by her relationship, that he doesn't want to make the same mistake twice. He's seen that this situation is potentially, he's very explicit at the beginning, this travelling with him has potentially got the potential to send Amy off the rails, and he very much wants to bring Rory into it as a kind of grounding mechanism for when it all goes tits up for whatever reason, as it inevitably will in the future. If only he'd said that. And there's something quite interesting about that. And again, it's it's another story that is explicitly foregrounding what it is to be with the Doctor and the compromises that you make and the changes that you make and the potential dark side of it. But although it's about that, it never really gets to grips with that. I mean, certainly less satisfyingly than School Reunion, a lot less satisfyingly than School Reunion. And so then it sort of feels like a lot of that stuff is running on the spot, whereas I think there's an unexamined... Sorry, I've gone on for a bit here.
No,
but there's an unexamined
point.
thread there that I think could have been quite productive.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thread is there, and you can see it's Moffat addressing what's happened before. I'm not sure if it's necessarily coming through that much in Matt Smith's performance, because I'm doubting he's sat down to watch the box sets of the previous ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's maybe either not developed or sacrificed in the name of making him a lovable schlub, and that's an easier way to get the kind of sitcom elements going. Arthur Darvill's a good actor. He's
really
very
good actor.
likeable in this, but it's kind of weird watching this again for the first time in so long. As soon as he gets on the TARDIS and the Doctor's saying, "Oh, you're going to say it's bigger on the inside," and he's kind of he's not even unimpressed. He's just like, "I know what you're going to say.
Yeah.
I've read up on all of this." That's a nice little bit. I would have liked to have seen more of that with Rory's character. But it just seems this guy who rolls his eyes a bit and accepts that he's just along for the ride, really.
Well, and where Rory generally doesn't work later on, he's where he's just there, especially when, I mean, again, one of the positives of this episode, we seem to have found quite a few, actually, when we started going through it, but one of the...
I'll bring you back down to
it.
First Sayward and now Moffat.
One of the positives of this episode, again, is the dialogue has an absence of the kind of zingy Moffat banter, which I find makes me want to claw my own ears off because it's so unbearable. I mean, there's certainly a lot of, there's a degree to which the dialogue is designed in places to be iconic and appear on a T-shirt, I'm sure. I mean, John, I bet you're about to raise the "Got my boys, got my spaceship" line.
I wasn't.
Oh, you're not? Okay, all right, okay, you surprised me there.
Different point.
But the dialogue, although the dialogue is kind of quite jokey, it doesn't quite have that sort of meta-textual banter shit that I find so unbearable when Moffat switches it on.
I agree with that, but I think there are two key problems here. The first is that he doesn't make the mistake, Whithouse here, that Sayward or that era of Doctor Who that we just reviewed often does, of having a big TARDIS crew and then having the Doctor pair with a much more interesting character.
Yeah.
It's very much about the Doctor, Amy and Rory.
They've made that gondola very boring.
Yes. And there is the tertiary character, well, I suppose he's the tetralogical character of Guido,
yes.
but he's very much a useful character.
He's explaining the local situation.
Yeah, exactly.
He's likeable enough.
Oh, he's likeable enough, but he's not taking away from the character development.
He can stand the confusion in his mind.
The problem we have, though, is that the characters are not sufficiently drawn.
Yeah.
So there isn't... Whithouse has made no structural mistake here.
No.
But the characters he has to play with are
on very faulty foundations.
Yeah, and although...
That's absolutely right. Sorry, yeah, when he's doing it last time round with Rose and Mickey and even Sarah, he's got that weight of stuff to bring to it. It's like, oh, shit, we know who these people are and we know what this means.
There's a weight of stuff that's brought to that in that episode. We don't think of Sarah Jane as this abandoned woman who never met another man for the next 30 years, what have you. That all happens in that episode. But none of that there's no equivalent level of character development or character writing.
I agree.
And Amy is just... There is nothing there. And, Arthur Darvill and Matt Smith are good enough actors, perhaps, to paper over the cracks there. I think we've said before that there's a degree to which... in this season, they're simply writing for a zany Doctor, but it could be the zany moments of Tennant rather than the zany moments of Matt Smith. And he brings a performance out of that that's very much his own. But I think that... And Darvill is a good enough actor, but I just don't think Karen Gillan is a good enough actor to bring out the nothing...
To bring out the
nothing that is in her character.
Or the idea that she loves this guy. I'm never convinced
that
she loves
Rory. There's a conflict here. I mean, at the heart of it, there is a huge conflict, and this is set up. It's set up explicitly at the beginning of The Beast Below, as we discussed. When there's that voiceover, it's like, on the night before my wedding, the man of my dreams appeared. All words to that effect. But so that is obviously meant to be the dramatic thrust, but it's so unearned, if they didn't tell you that this was a situation, you'd never buy it.
Also, there is...
Sorry, point 2, John.
No, but point 1, point 2... There is no believable sexual chemistry between Arthur Darvill and Karen Gillan.
No.
Which may be partly the point, because there's meant to be a thing of I'm the geek who landed the very pretty girl, which is in itself, by the way, slightly problematic as an area.
Yeah.
Or she went for the next best,
Yeah, exactly. Or that she has settled for it's a lot of Amy's character is built around the fact that she is an attractive woman, which, I'm not denying the right of men or women to be attractive, or for that be it.
She's a very attractive woman.
She is a very attractive woman, but it does feel, let's just say Moffat's got form here.
Yes, absolutely.
For not really developing female characters.
Or choosing a cheap joke.
Yeah.
Which I think is what we've got here. And then by the end of the season, we've got him as the centurion who looked after her for 2,000 years.
Now, come off it, mate.
You've not done anything to justify this.
Yeah, it's very
not any building.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, and as we touched on last time, it's the indignities that he sort of heaps on these characters, in the name of quirky detail.
But it's also Moffat always leaves himself open to accusations of sexism. Through doing what I think he thinks he is this big progressive guy who could not be less sexist.
Yeah, he's writing a sassy female lead for Doctor Who.
Yeah, sassy female lead for Doctor Who, and showing that the not alpha male beefcake who's sensitive can get the girl. But this in itself
is because it's the girl rather than
but it's like,
this
don't
character.
worry, lads. Even if you're a weed, because these days you moisturise and maybe do your own ironing, you'll get the sexy, curvy girl of your dreams. And this in itself is actually quite a problematic thing.
Yeah,
because it still puts on a pedestal a certain vision of of femininity and female beauty. Anyway, that's point 1.
But but it's all predicated on the fact that none of the foundations of their relationship work. I mean, even in the 11th Hour, which is an episode I like very much, she very much is like a city type character, yet seemingly she's in this sort of little backwater village in the middle of nowhere, working as a kissogram.
Much
which
call for
doesn't
kissograms.
Really make I know it just doesn't make any sense at all.
Anyway, so that's point 1. The second problem, and this is where I do disagree with you, although I think the sitcom repartee is a lot better than Moffat's very arch stuff.
Yes.
I think Whithouse writes comedy better.
Yes.
I still think that this episode is too much sort of filler to set piece, and the set piece is comedy. And that doesn't... It's really just sort of a frog going from comedic lily pad to comedic lily pad. And there isn't really a sort of...
Just comedic lily pads are not that funny either. I mean,
they're okay, but they make it all about that, and then they make it all about that, and having done so, there's not really a lot there. It's meant to be some space for these characters to breathe, but there are no characters there, so he fills it with a few jokes, and in the end, it all feels very flat.
It is interesting watching... All right, the reason we've picked these 3 stories is because they're set within 100 years of each other, and that was a nice little conceit. It's more interesting watching this next to the Visitation, where they're both pretty much doing what you think Doctor Who should do traditionally, which is history, aliens, An
alien is like, aliens,
all this kind of
history,
stuff.
Yeah.
And it is, Jesus Christ, having Saywood doing a better job.
Yeah.
Because, the Visitation isn't fantastic, but we think it was an enjoyable, breezy bit of TV, certainly within the context of the time, and I think even now. Whereas this, like I say, there's a lot. It should be promising. I don't even mind that much that the vampires turn out to be fish monsters.
Yeah,
the location
Get that
work
on a t-shirt.
The location work looks good, and I was really watching this time thinking maybe this is going to be a lot better than I remember. But as John has just said, I think so much of this is, and I've tried to be as positive as possible about Moffat while we've been reviewing it over the last few shows. Yeah. It is when the dialogue just falls down to the zingers, which I just find I've got no stake in this. It feels like you put an ice pick into something and you're just falling down. You're failing to really grip onto anything. And we started this review being unusually positive, but it feels like the wet tissue paper has given way a little bit.
No, absolutely. But no, I mean, we started it saying that it's very slight, and I think, by virtue of the fact that, I think it is a breezy enough 45 minutes of television. It doesn't really touch the sides. There are some lovely visuals. There are some great performances. Lead performance Helen McCrory, as said, is very good. There's some very nice visuals. There's a few sort of reasonably exciting moments of action or whatever. But it doesn't. There's sort of nothing to it, and that's the thing that is like you could. And this is the problem with it, I think, is that it is designed to be an emotional arc episode. It's not designed to do.
Or at least set up a dynamic that we're going to be engaged with.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's in the way that we talked about School Reunion last month, where we said that the whole school storyline is simply the contrivance for which this quite insightful emotional story is played out. It's insightful in terms of our relationship with these characters, but also it's insightful on a human level. That all plays out around, the MacGuffin, which is the business going on in the school. The vampire stuff is very much the MacGuffin here, but there just isn't enough meat on the bones in terms of, and I'm going to give credit to Whithouse because, I don't think he's a bad writer at all. And, I do think School Reunion is extremely good, and I love Being Human, as I've said. But I just don't think he has enough to work with here to sort of salvage that kind of emotional heft that really this needs. I mean, it's like you need to feel in some way, you need to feel the conflict in Amy at this point for this to actually work. And actually, I sort of think, I don't know when we're going to review it, but sort of oddly, the kind of the parallel universe Simon Nye episode that follows this actually does a slightly better job of at least drawing that out as a sort of sense of conflict in it.
I've got to say, I've never seen Being Human. I know it gets a lot of. It's a very well regarded show,
good.
But we've been comparing this
because I loved it at this point. By the way, sorry, just a sidebar here, knowing that it was written by a guy who'd previously written for Doctor Who, I remember going around and saying, at that point, Being Human was more like the kind of Doctor Who I wanted to watch than Doctor Who was at that point. That was
my point there is we've been contrasting this episode with School Reunion a lot.
Yes.
Does this get to how much of School Reunion in this episode have been script edited?
Well,
I mean, is it Whithouse we're talking about here, or the polish that's been put on it by the respective showrunners?
Well, I think, this is a sort of feeling that I have, is that especially in these early series, these early sort of Moffat series, where the writing styles, I think they do diverge. Obviously Moffat sets the course, but from what I understand of his production process, is nothing near like the showrunner polish that from him that scripts used to get from RTD. And so what I think you got with School Reunion was a very good script from Toby Whithouse, given an excellent Russell T Davies polish. Whereas I think this is probably, I'm speculating wildly here, so I could be wrong. But my hunch is that this is slightly more just Whithouse working with the materials that he's been given. And, and that's why, I think, just basic things like, when we watch other episodes by other writers, but we hear the Russell T Davies dialogue, I think you do hear a lot less of the Stephen Moffat dialogue here. I don't think he's done really that much with it other than give notes. I don't think he's sat there and rewritten the thing from top to bottom. But it's working on the fairly shaky foundations that he set up.
You mentioned earlier there's some action sequences in this. There are, I think they're okay. Is there much peril from the vampires?
No, and indeed,
given that's all the fish people are.
And indeed, the climax.
Oh my god, that's terrible!
The climax where the Doctor climbs the tower.
Puts his finger very gently on the clock to stop it,
to deactivate the rain machine.
Yeah, it doesn't. I'm trying to think of the other ones where the Doctor has climbed up a thing. Daleks in Manhattan.
The Idiot's Lantern.
Yeah, and
Idiot's Lantern. Yeah.
Gatus.
Those examples, the coats flailing and all that sort of stuff. I don't know. Maybe it was just something in the acting or whatever. But
I think this is very poorly paced.
And I noticed in that
Yeah.
scene the green screen looked noticeably not great. I mean,
some very obvious.
I'm a big fan of.
Well,
the fanship, the Brit effect should be representative, but that seemed noticeably poor.
The real problem from a director's perspective, who was it who directed this?
Johnny Campbell.
I think the problem that Campbell, the mistake he makes actually, because when I think of Idiot's Lantern,
is he Martin Campbell's less successful brother?
I don't know, Wikipedia's not giving me the deal.
Not coming up, chums.
Not giving me the stuff on that. I'm just thinking visually here about Idiot's Lantern and Daleks in Manhattan. The way to add peril is to film it from above, to look down and show how far down he's got to go. Most of that Matt Smith thing is filmed
Shot
horizontally.
straight flat on.
In a landscape fashion. And so you end up in the worst of all possible worlds. You don't see how far he has to fall, which is your peril, and you've got much more of the green screen background behind him where there's the possibility of it looking a bit shonky.
I mean, my hunch, what I read from this, is that I suspect...
Gave some thought to that.
Yeah. No, yes.
That was good.
No, and you're right. I agree. I'm developing your point, which would be to say that my feeling is that probably a lot of this was that overran in the edit, or that this overran and they had to cut a lot in the edit, because there are huge swathes of like just narrative or just like how do you get from A to B logic in that final sequence. It's such a rush to wrap it up that literally they walk back into the throne room. He says, "You unplug the chair, I'll go up to the roof," and then they do that, and then fine, and sort of with very little.
And then we have the moving end with Helen McCrory. She's upset that her visual deception device, her perception filter's failed. So she then takes the dress off that doesn't actually exist?
Yes.
Maybe I'm not intelligent enough, but there was a symbolism to that. It was played very seriously, but there was a symbolism there that I simply didn't get. It was played as if there was a real serious point being made, but I couldn't tell what the serious. And the moral of the story is, if you are a mother fish to 10,000 male fish and you don't manage to make some females out of humans for them to fuck, then you
must surrender yourself to
feed yourself to them.
Well, it felt
more
like
we've all been there.
It felt more like they have to get rid of the villain somehow, or the character somehow.
Yeah, but it was
in that respect, it's not that different to Toberman has to get electrocuted at the end of Tomb of the Cybermen or something. It's just it feels like they haven't really got a good way of wrapping up.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's not a good way of wrapping up. My problem
Would
with
you
it
rather
was,
have seen her boiling in a barn in Pudding Lane?
Well, yeah.
Yes, but that's not my point. My point is that they did this. If she just sort of run out going, "Oh, I failed, ah," and then thrown herself in, and then it was clearly eaten because she left her perception filter on, and therefore was mistaken for a human woman rather than a fish. Fine, but there was this whole thing of her sacrificing herself and stripping off in a way that was meant to be filled with some kind of meaning, but I couldn't actually discern any meaning.
No.
So ultimately, a pretty effective piece of television in the sense that it didn't bore us. There was some great location work, but the decent writing was, I guess we feel let down somewhat by the characterization.
I think we're drawing the same conclusion as we did from the Visitation somewhat, really, is that it rises above some of the other stuff from the era that we have serious problems with, but ultimately doesn't really touch the sides.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably from that first season one of the more traditional stories, isn't it? It's kind of this Victory of the Daleks and to some extent the Chibnall Solarian story, which obviously we're not reviewing those other two now, but they looking back after we've seen several years of Moffat and the entirety of the Matt Smith season era, that's a little bit of a perspective to take on it.
Yeah.
This feels more like we're sticking to our guns with the...
Yeah.
It's reminding people of what the RTD kind of era of the show is. Wisely, I think. It's just, I don't think it did it as well.
This Halloween, we find out, are vampires real?
You drink people's blood.
Correct. Their love lives.
Sex is very disgusting.
That's an emotion that I've just kind of gotten rid of.
Their families.
So who were you setting on fire?
Well, that was my son.
An all-new Tyrant starts now.
And finally tonight, where are we heading back to? 1572, I think? for...
Oh, so we're only 8 years earlier than Vampires in Venice.
Absolutely.
We've done the show in reverse chronological.
The Massacre, or the Massacre from St. Bartholomew's Eve,
Yes.
by John Lucarotti, which sees William Hartnell as the First Doctor and Peter Purvis as Stephen, landing in Paris, where after a little bit of deduction, the Doctor works out they're in the 1570s.
Yep.
And he's very keen to meet up with a kind of famous man of medicine called Preslin.
Yes.
He's also unusually keen that Stephen doesn't come with him and tells him to stay put and not get involved with anything. So, Stephen, one of the less celebrated Doctor Who companions, gets to pretty much do this adventure solo. And pretty much as soon as the Doctor goes, he gets kind of wrapped up in a near fairly serious pub brawl between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. And thereafter gets kind of caught up and unearths more about a conspiracy which is being set up by the Queen Mother, the Catholic Queen Mother, to wipe out the Huguenots.
Catherine de Medici.
Yes. Other significant characters here are a servant girl, Anne Chaplet, who was...
Anne
Chaplet, who was overheard more than she should have. And most significantly, a Catholic priest, the Abbot of Amboise, who looks identical to the First Doctor.
Doppelganger.
Now, so far on the podcast, we've been extremely positive about William Hartnell era stories. Yeah. And I've got the sense from both of you, we've not really discussed this, that you might be a little underwhelmed with this?
Well, how did we watch this, first of all?
Oh, that's an important thing to say, yes. So, it no longer exists even as telesnaps. We've got a soundtrack.
So there's a soundtrack. There's a reconstruction on YouTube, which is a Photoshop
publicity
affair.
Stills,
Someone's
largely
cobbled it together from
and done a good job considering.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't watch that. I listened to...
What are the photos? What are the photos of on the reconstruction?
In this particular one.
Yeah. Did you watch the reconstruction, John?
There are a few publicity stills. I think the one I always see is of the throne room with the Queen Mother.
Yeah.
And there's one of Stephen and the Doctor in the tavern together.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of others were probably taken from... There's a few of... Andre Morel. There are probably, I don't know, half a dozen publicity stills, but you can see a lot of them get reused, and a lot of the others, particularly...
I did recognise one of the actors.
Yeah, there's Chris
Tranchell,
who turns up in Invasion of Time. Andre Morel was one of the Quatermasses.
Oh, yes,
if that's the collective. The other big guest star here is Eric Thompson, Emma Thompson's dad. And
the Magic Roundabout guy.
Roundabout
Who does he play?
He's one of the sort of Protestant...
Gaston.
Yes.
Oh.
So yeah, my apologies, I can't remember all the names of the characters.
So the reason why I'm asking these questions is because I listened to this this morning on public transport, but using the audio version that was released a couple of years ago.
So this is the soundtrack.
So it's
with
the
soundtrack.
Links. It's not the audiobook, but it's the soundtrack with narrated links done with a minimum of effort
by Joey Pasquale.
by Peter Purvis. So it's like one of the weirder episodes of Crufts I've ever watched, where of him like sort of just lightly adding a really style-free commentary on it. It's so underwritten, those links. It's
I'm a big fan of Peter Purvis as Stephen, and I've not heard The Massacre as an audio soundtrack, but I'd certainly got Dalek's Master Plan several years back.
Yeah.
And he did episode on episode, because it's like ultimately 13 episodes.
Yeah, there's a lot of reading.
He eventually just sounds like you go... Doctor Who.
Yeah.
He sounds like he's just broken his shoelace while he's trying to get a bus or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of dryly relating what's happening in the action that you can't see with as minimum of drama and peril as possible. I mean, he's not helped by a really flat script. But yeah, so I've not, obviously there aren't any telesnaps, but I literally experienced this as a piece of radio. Which was quite an interesting way to go about it, I thought.
Interesting in what way?
I don't know. I rather enjoyed it. I mean, it's like I found the reconstructions that we've done for quite a tough watch, especially when even when they're done with telesnaps, you are sort of effectively looking at a slideshow. Whereas, I did this. I was wandering around. I was on public transport. I sat in Pret for a bit and listened to a bit on my headphones, and just approached it as a bit of radio. And to be honest, I think for a story that's as talky as this, and this is a very, very talky serial, it's kind of all talk, apart from a couple of key moments,
And no trousers.
Yeah, I would really like to see the visuals, but I think I got a good sense of what it was just from the soundtrack. We're sort of hedging around the point here. Did we like this? What do we think of this, John?
I think it's a hugely unsuccessful piece of Doctor Who.
Right,
but I think it's quite an interesting drama.
Yeah. There's barely any Doctor Who in it.
No,
yeah.
but it's not just that there's not even the Doctor in it. I mean, William Hartnell, I think, famously went on holiday for part of while it was being filmed.
Despite playing two parts.
Yeah,
despite playing two characters in it,
he certainly had a break while they were filming episode 2.
Yes, he's not in it for huge stretches.
No,
as either character.
This is a hugely for me. I did watch the sort of reconstruction version.
Yeah,
and there are enough snaps to give you a sense, I think, of some of the sets they built.
What it might have looked like.
It's a real pity this is one that is lost, because it really does look like an effective, immersive world that they did build. The streets of very, very early modern Paris. It looks like it was quite good.
Yes.
So there's that. It's clearly densely plotted. The characters are very well drawn.
Yeah.
And it's a meaty subject.
It is.
The Huguenot persecution in 16th century France.
Yeah. And do you know what they don't as a niche topic in the way that the modern series would do. We're doing Shakespeare, and like literally, and the version of Shakespeare from Shakespeare in Love as well, not even the real Shakespeare.
Yeah.
In the way that history is kind of even in later Doctor Who drawn with quite primary colours. It doesn't, and I'm by no means an expert on the period, i.e. I know virtually nothing, and in fact a lot of my understanding of this period might well be drawn from what I heard on this series this morning. So again, John, you with the history degree can probably set us straight. But it is uncompromising in laying the history out and saying this was the situation, and it is a drama set in that period of history with all that is going on, and it's very, very careful to sort of draw out all the different strands of what's going on.
Who was the original commissioner of Doctor Who? Sidney Newman, wasn't it?
Yes.
And isn't this basically what he wanted Doctor Who to be?
He wanted to go between historical education and scientific education, and then maybe sideways steps to do,
But I mean, I'm wondering what 8 to 10-year-old kids who'd watched the Dalek Master Plan as the previous serial, then watching a 4-part series. I mean, this...
Sorry, does this follows directly on from the Dalek Master Plan, does it? Right,
and
okay.
I am struggling to see how any child could possibly enjoy this piece of television.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult.
I found the themes interesting, and much of the acting was good, and I'm not saying...
Some great performances, very classical in their styling. But,
classical, but yeah, no, absolutely, it's an older code, sir, but it checked out.
Yeah.
Really good, and weighty themes, and I particularly liked... I mean, this is 1966, isn't it?
Yeah.
I particularly liked how there are so many evident parallels with debates that are taking place contemporarily.
Absolutely.
Around persecution, particularly in the United States with the civil rights movement, the consideration of how you treat minorities, etc., etc. That's something that the crucible of that thinking is.
And this doesn't shy away from the social context of the events in which it occurs. It's not just like history recounted through events. It's history recounted through people.
Yes, but what it doesn't do is have a sort of, which I think they probably would do with New Who, and I don't think it's always effective.
Is have a fish man. Or a reptile with a gay robot.
No, that's not what I mean. They don't have a bit where Stephen says, yes, this is much like in our own time, where, I mean, Doctor, isn't this exactly like the situation?
Yes. Well, the Doctor doesn't contextualise anything.
No.
There's no context for it. It's just simply, this is what happened.
But the reason it's an unsuccessful piece of Doctor Who is that, for me, the fact that they are time travellers arriving in this situation is completely irrelevant. It's not like, I mean, Lucarotti wrote, I believe,
The Aztecs,
which we talked about,
which is all about modern view contrasting with
well, that's about
tourism
your understanding of history. It's not, I mean, it is about the Aztecs in that it's very deeply researched in its understanding of the Aztecs, but in terms of what the story is about, in terms of what we're looking at, when we're watching the Aztecs, it is about your interpretation and your understanding of history. It's not asking the question, what were the Aztecs like? It's asking the question, what is history?
Whereas this is a 4-part, 25-minute drama about the persecution of Huguenots in 16th century France.
It wouldn't take much changing of the script to just make it a drama, a historical drama.
No,
if Stephen was just someone who'd arrived from England and
that's
didn't
the
really
thing. You just have to lop a few bits out. And I'm going to say, I think it is a good 4-part drama about the persecution of Huguenots in Catholic era, in that era of France, and it does. I think it does create an atmosphere. I mean, it creates a very febrile sense of the tension.
It's tight, isn't it?
It's incredibly tight, and you have this real sense both through the performances and the dialogue. And I mean, it lays the history on with a trowel, uncompromisingly so. But it does create the sense of this pressure cooker situation.
Yeah, things are closing in. And
things are closing in, and there are people on all sides of this debate, but you are spiralling towards a horrific event happening.
It feels... I suppose the only thing that I think, particularly the first Doctor and his take on you can't change history, not one word, that the only thing that the sort of time traveller element and the William Hartnell element adds to this is the grim predetermination of even the efforts of the outcome.
Absolutely.
And the efforts. The very fact that I guess they wouldn't have known at the time. They wouldn't have called the serial the Massacre because each of the individual episodes.
But even now, there's some debate whether to call it the Massacre,
or the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve,
much punchier, the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve.
That thing of you feel that there's no way to escape, even when Stephen is trying to do various different things to stop it. There's never a sense you feel it will work.
Yes.
You feel there's only one way that's going to go, and that's because there's been a very febrile atmosphere built into the drama. It's a great piece of drama. I just don't think it works at all as a piece of Doctor Who.
And I think part of the reason for that is for how even though William Hartnell is playing two roles here, he's playing the Doctor and he's playing the Abbot of Amboise, and there's a couple of things to talk about there which we'll come on to. But it's very much Stephen's story, and in a sense, the only thing that kind of anchors this to Doctor Who is Stephen's attempts to get to the Doctor, and then when he thinks the Doctor's dead after the Abbot is murdered, him trying to find the TARDIS key, and then the revelation's fun. And to be honest, pretty much as soon as he relocates the Doctor, they are straight in the TARDIS and they're getting the hell out of there. But I sort of want to pick John up on a point that he made when we looked at the gunfighters. But when we looked at the gunfighters, I remember John raised the point that, in his opinion, that pure historical Doctor Who doesn't work because either there's a trade-off to be made amongst the authentic presentation of history and the artificial creation of the sci-fi characters that have been dropped into it. And there's ultimately going to become a point where the two can't coexist as a meaningful piece of drama. And obviously then we looked at the Aztecs a couple of months after that, which kind of takes the opposite question by, like we said, just asking, what is history? What is your understanding of history? It's about that, not necessarily about how do these people survive the Aztecs. But I almost think this kind of splits the difference. I mean, I think the Gunfighters is... it's Doctor Who doing genre. It's Doctor Who doing the Wild West film as opposed to the authentic Wild West. But there are attempts made to... I think at least address in a dramatically interesting way what it would be to be in that situation. So, cut off from the Doctor, it treats Stephen simply as being a guy who is dropped into an incredibly febrile, complicated, tense situation that's about to bubble over. And is left to be entirely reliant on his wits in order to get through that, and literally finding the Doctor is his way out of that situation. Now, it doesn't feel very Doctor Who-y because the Doctor himself really doesn't have any role to play. I mean, he goes off to see Preslin, and then eventually he's reunited at the end.
Stephen being from the future doesn't really make much odds either.
No, it doesn't make any odds at all, really. And I think that the doppelganger subplot is, I think, quite an elegant way in which to involve certainly Stephen into the narrative in a dramatically meaningful way. I think it's very thoughtful in terms of how, through its limited attempt to integrate Doctor Who into this historical story which it's telling, it doesn't. There's no point at it where you think the sci-fi elements are compromising the history. But I mean, I think John's right. He doesn't feel very much like Doctor Who at all.
No, not at all. I mean, I think that's what we all feel with it. It's good drama. It just doesn't feel like Doctor Who. And I'll just go back to John's point. I'm not sure what a child would have felt. We can't put ourselves in the shoes of an audience 50 years ago, but I really can't imagine this cutting the mustard, especially when you've got the Daleks' master plan before it, which again largely doesn't exist, but it's an adventure, and this is followed by the Ark, which is a much more traditional piece of science fiction, and this just feels really wildly at odds. And I mean, most of the other historicals from this period are a little more fun and jokey.
Yes.
I don't know how much store we should hold by ratings from 1966. I don't know how sophisticated the collection of that data
or meaningful,
was. But it is noticeable that the first episode is 8 million.
Yeah.
And then the following 3 are 6.
Yes.
I can well believe that was the case.
But I'm going to say, and I think this is, then...
But that's only the overnights, the catch-up.
When they factor in iPlayer, that'll go up by at least, best part of
another million.
Yeah. But being the Hartnell era, and it being an era that I think we've rightly praised for its surprises and how modern it feels, I'm going to go out on the limb and then say that the last 10 minutes of this, so basically the TARDIS sequence, absolutely floored me.
All of it?
I know
the bit that's good.
It goes on a bit, and there are a couple of problems within it. But because I remember looking, so I was listening to the audiobook of this on my iPhone, and and it is chilling to see, an ending to an episode of Doctor Who where they flee to the TARDIS dematerialises, and then, I'm only getting
and
this...
the Doctor's attitude is just, fuck it.
Well, I'm only getting this on audio, but, like, the screams at the massacre actually taking place go on for ages, and that's long.
What you won't know then...
punishing. I mean, I don't know what you would... What would
This
I
is in the reconstruction, but apparently this is how it was done originally as well, is they have kind of illustrations, contemporary illustrations over that. But for quite a while, isn't it?
Well, fine. Yeah, I mean, it goes on for a long time. And so it's you're under no illusion as to the gravitas of what's happened. It's a bloodbath.
So you'd hear the screams, but you were only seeing sort of pictures.
As it was on the reconstruction. Those kind of history
drawings.
book.
Yeah. History book drawings.
Well, that's how they did it there, but do we know how it was in...
I think that's how it was done in the original as well.
Okay,
I wouldn't be surprised if they found the original illustration.
It is really elegant, and the impact of it comes across. It's like having spent 3.5 episodes up until this point, for this pressure cooker situation to boil over, you feel the terror of it and the oppression of it.
And then the Doctor says that all of the characters you've just met die.
Yes. But that scene is amazing, because that is so... the whole essence of that scene of the Doctor, of Stephen challenging the Doctor on the morality of what it is. The line that I made the notice down, if your researches have so little regard for human life, I want no part of it. Like, Stephen is disgusted at the idea that the Doctor's curiosity about time and space means that he's prepared to be an innocent bystander to a bloodbath. And then so they land in 1966, Stephen storms out, and then the Doctor effectively gets a soliloquy, which is a tiny bit overwritten in places, but it is the Doctor having a moment of self-doubt, where he challenges himself on the compromises of his conduct and of how he goes about these travels, and whether or not it is actually right for him to be doing what he's doing. And he briefly considers whether he can go back to his home planet. So maybe I will go back to my own planet, but I can't. And he's wrestling with himself, and he sounds really racked with emotion, like the most of the limited Hartnells I've come across. He sounds tormented by this, and I think that's the whole essence of what and I think certainly what Russell T Davies brought to the table, and what Moffat has tried to do with more a mixed degree. But this idea of like the moral challenge to the Doctor, and then the idea of him as a conflicted individual about what he does and the lifestyle he leads and the effect it has on other people. Like, for something which was effectively a history play, for that to come through in the last 10 minutes, I genuinely found really impactful. And I thought, suddenly, again, to quote the thing that John says every time we do a William Hartnell story, there is nothing new in New Who. You know, I had no idea that there was a scene in 60s Doctor Who where the Doctor has a crisis of conscience alone in the TARDIS after a companion has left him about the morality of what he does. I thought it was incredible.
The thing it reminds me of is the end of Fires of Pompeii. Is that what it's called? Which almost seems like Russell T Davies was aware of the massacre. I'm sure he is. He definitely is. But it's almost like you couldn't do that now with the Doctor just saying this is a done deal and we've got to go.
Well, in terms
you have to have a companion challenging him and getting him to go back and make some kind
But I mean, setting aside the fact that there's direct parallels with the history there and, you know, you have to salvage something from that situation. You know, that scene taken as a standalone, I mean, to me, it sort of reminded me of Journey's End, of like a situation where, you know, the Doctor himself is kind of forcibly confronted with the moral quandaries of what it is to be him and how he lives his life.
And you can see why that scene was the one that Gatiss used in Adventure in Space and Time, almost as kind of Hartnell himself addressing the role.
Yeah,
you know,
I think it's amazing. And then you know,
Dodo runs in.
And then Dodo runs in, which is a contrivance beyond belief, you know. But actually, no, I say that. Actually, that is John Lucarotti's way, or as it is in the 4th episode, John Lucarotti and Donald
Runaway
Tosh.
Bride, isn't it?
Well,
in a way,
or of doing the Fires of Pompeii, of sort of salvaging. Yeah, I mean, it's
or the Titanic flying into the. It's
part
cutting through.
We can't leave it on too grim a note.
No. But it's part Runaway Bride. It's part Fires of Pompeii. In that also that is a way, in part, of at least salvaging. You know, the history situation. I mean, there's a total air of bollocks that this woman who's walked in London might, because of a similar surname, possibly, as they say, possibly be related to Anne Chapelet, the servant girl who died in France.
But the
500
point's clear
years
even if it doesn't add
But the
up.
point's clear enough that they're trying to salvage something positive. And then you see the Doctor going from a moment of self-doubt to a moment of sheer neediness. I mean, I think it's so bold for them to write him a line where he says, you know, in terms of making him seem weak, don't you think she's the spitting image of my granddaughter? And Susan. And then Stephen says, I don't know, I never met your granddaughter. I mean, I thought that scene was fucking amazing.
Yeah.
So, two major things we've not talked about. This is mostly Peter Purvis's Stephen.
Yes.
Even though we have reviewed The Gunfighters, I don't think he really shone in that.
No.
So how do you find him here?
I think he's brilliant in this.
I think Stephen's a fantastic companion. I mean, and I love
because he carries it. He's the lead, essentially, for this, because Hartnell's barely in it.
I think you get a sense of the conflict he often has with the Doctor, and it's just weird to be watching that after watching one with Rory, because I could really imagine Rory being retooled to have much more of that dynamic, especially because this guy's hanging out with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
But let's not whitter on about Moffat too much. I do think, because I grew up with Peter Purvis as a Blue Peter presenter, and mentioning Crufts, but yeah, I think he's really good.
He's
great.
Is good.
Yeah.
And you know, you feel, because I mean, it's a very sort of classical thespian, you know, not necessarily heavyweight in terms of big names, although there are a few names in the cast, as you pointed out, but there are, you know, it's a very classical style cast doing this as a BBC period drama, and Peter Purvis completely holds his own in that. You know, it's like that thrust of his desperation from from A to B, and you know, his protectiveness of Anne and all of that stuff. I think that comes across brilliantly. And then, yeah, as I say, that final scene where he walks out on the Doctor in disgust, and that's far more powerful than Tegan's "This isn't fun anymore." You know, in Resurrection of the Daleks, you know, he's saying, "I don't want any part of it."
I think actually that's an unwittingly powerful scene. Because I think it's
an accidental meta commentary on our experience of watching it for the rest of the show.
But your point stands.
And Stephen ostensibly leaves the Doctor, you know, wordlessly. They don't say, well, bye, I'm off, or anything. He just walks out in disgust.
But
does it mention that he flicks the V's in the audio commentary?
I don't know whether
I
don't know if he moved him.
Flips the bird and
Stephen comes across as so honest and so determined and so nice, but it never slips into being sort of disgustingly earnest.
No, he's just a good man.
And I totally agree with you that as I mean, you said it already, but that moment where the Doctor says, "Doesn't she look like my granddaughter?" It's really because it's so
But for
disarming.
then, for Stephen to follow it up with, I've never met your granddaughter.
Yeah, the Doctor is so lost at that moment that he doesn't even catch the. And of course, he's just mentioned all of the other companions. I read around, and I believe weren't Ian and Barbara meant to appear in this episode?
I don't know about
at the
that.
end. I read this on the.
I love
like
though that
he
says
Chatterton.
He says Barbara and Chatterton. Chesterton.
Yes.
Corrects himself. It's so great.
But yeah, I mean, apparently they were meant to sort of be there on the again, sort of nothing new in New Who, but you can imagine Moffat doing a thing where a couple of companions would wave from across.
Or Karen Gillan in a wig would come back for the
exactly
finale. The other thing to mention is
why is Dodo Scouse? Oh, sorry, that's like
William Hartnell's dual role, which we've not really gone into.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I was sort of looking as someone who genuinely esteems William Hartnell as a like genuinely great actor. I was very much looking forward to that aspect of it. Which I knew about in advance, but was a bit disappointed by how both characters are pretty much kept out of the limelight because I do think of all the weeks for William Hartnell to take a holiday, the story where he's playing two characters maybe wasn't the best one to do. But and it's not an original observation. Other people have said this before. It is striking as well that it is his performance as the Abbot is very cold. There's only a couple of scenes where he does it, but it's very clipped. It's very business-like. And a lot of that kind of umming and ahhing and hesitation and stuff is, and we've said this before, is not because William Hartnell is a doddery old actor playing a doddery old man, and so they just leave it in. That's a very conscious acting choice, and you do see that by seeing him play another character. Like, so much of the Doctor's kind of bumbliness is a very conscious thing that he's doing as a performer, and it only makes me love his Doctor more, even though we don't have much of him in it.
It's very clear when you see his performance as the Abbot how much of a performance the Doctor is. One of the things I wanted to maybe mention was because I think especially at the end where the Doctor again has this debate about intervention, that seems to be a very Lucarotti theme. We discussed obviously the Aztecs, but I was reading around and again it seems like this has a joint credit, Lucarotti and Donald Tosh, and Donald Tosh was one of the script editors at the time. I reading around, Lucarotti wanted his name thrown off the credit.
This doesn't feel dumbed down. In fact, it's like, frankly, it could have been dumbed down a bit to the extent that, I did find, especially the middle section with all the deliberations about whether or not to go to war and all that stuff, that the historical detail came so thick and fast, it did slightly lose me.
But it's interesting because I found a Daily Record interview with Donald Tosh. And he basically says John Lucarotti had sent in a script, hadn't had any time to do any research, which was unlike him, and he missed the whole point of the story and everything else that was going on. And it's a period I know a lot about. And so I told John a lot of what he had written was rubbish. We had a huge, great row, and I told Johnny we're going to have to commission a new story, but he said, no, we've got to do it. And so anyway, basically...
This is from the Daily Record?
Yeah, the Daily Record.
Were people that bothered?
Well, no, this is from...
It was in the sidebar of shame.
So this was an interview from 2014 with Donald Tosh.
Donald Tosh flaunts his curves.
Our readers wanted to know.
It does seem that it was quite extensively rewritten to include more of the history, and so you do get a sense as a viewer that was moral argument of that final 15 minutes, with the intervention and then the reflection on. The character, Stephen, making his stand, the Doctor having his moment of reflection. That feels very Lucarotti. That feels very in line with the Aztecs.
Very in line with the Aztecs,
and Lucarotti perhaps more interested in the idea of what does it mean for characters from this era to think about this era, rather than wanting to have a very accurate historical drama going through a narrative.
Yes.
Of a particular incident.
That makes sense.
So you can imagine then Tosh going, well, this isn't at all...
It's not what happened.
Yeah. But that perhaps wasn't so interesting to Lucarotti. But I find the melding of it quite interesting, as again, I don't think it really is a hugely successful piece of Doctor Who, but it's a great drama with this interesting 15 minutes of John Lucarotti Doctor Who at the end of it.
I mean, that's the thing. I think it's great. I think it's it's a tough listen in my case.
Make it sound like a Scott Walker album or something.
Yeah, this is a touch of that. It's
a man who listens to John Hassel.
I know, absolutely. It's
John Hassel's all right. John Zorn, maybe.
Oh no, that's Dan, our friend Dan Orty. Yeah. It's uncompromising in terms of presenting the history, but presents the drama of that period very well. I get a sense the bubbling cauldron of stuff that's going on, and the unpleasantness at the time. But then, like I say, that final 10-minute sequence, just came out the gate and knocked me sideways in terms of something I wasn't expecting. And then I thought, they called all this stuff early, the Time Lord Victorious, the arrogance of the Doctor. It's all there.
No, I'm very proud of the fact that I was in it. It's quite interesting. I did 46 episodes in total, counting the one when I wasn't playing Stephen, when I was playing Morton Dill. That was in a year. And Colin Baker was the Doctor for 3 years. He did 29 episodes.
Okay, well, for the second time, it's that well-loved part of the show where we dip into our bulging mail sack and see what you've had to say about some of the stories that we're including in this episode.
Thanks for contributing.
John, that's John just...
reaching right into the bulging sack.
We know what John's doing there. But anyway, this month we've had a letter from Lewis Baston of Camden in London. And he has said... enjoyed the Visitation at the time in 1982, but when I watched the DVD I was less impressed. It's workmanlike Doctor Who by the numbers, but I wouldn't hire anyone to be script editor on the strength of it, which I guess we kind of touched on. I mean, he's
talking about Eric Sayward here.
He is talking about Eric Sayward here, who we've mentioned once or twice before.
Well, actually, I don't know if we said this in the review. This
was written by Eric Sayward.
Yeah, however, I can kind of see why in this first season, if Sayward did just deliver 2 perfectly functional scripts in that, probably quite swiftly, you can see why you would take him on. As opposed to, let's say, Chris Bidmead, who probably did a much more imaginative job, but you don't necessarily want someone who's got flights of fancy.
What we don't know is how much polish there was.
Yeah.
How much effort did it take the script editor to get it this decent?
My gut instinct is Anthony Root didn't do very much, and it was pretty much that's pure Sayward.
100%. I don't think from this anyone would have necessarily thought that he was going to take Doctor Who in a guns and machismo violence direction.
But I guess, would you hire Chibnall off the back of his bloody episodes?
I have very strong views on that, which I'll save for another podcast.
Until then.
You'll explain later.
Okay, well, that's us for another month. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed our trip into the 16th/17th centuries there.
Drop the sonic device.
Oh, I feel like you've just killed an old friend.
John,
yes. I feel like you've just killed John.
On that bombshell.
Thank you very much for listening. As ever, if you want to send us any comments about the show or about any of the stories that we covered for us to read in a future episode, you can tweet us at ExplainLaterPod, or you can get in touch via our Facebook wall, which is facebook.com/I'llExplainLater, or you can email us at hello@I'llExplainLater.com. And as I say every month, please do leave us a review on iTunes and tell your friends. We've got a couple of ratings on there. We are slowly climbing up the search results. If you search Doctor Who on iTunes, we are now down to about page 5 or 6, so, we'd like to...
Yeah, we're just behind Two Hearts, the Doctor Who dating podcast.
Is that a thing?
No.
Oh, right, okay. I thought...
Got to whip out my sonic screwdriver then.
But thank you very much for listening. From me, Matt Needer.
Me, Jim Hall.
Me, John West.
We'll see you next month.
Bye.
Ciao.
Sun in the kitchen, boys still singing. When you get hungry, I'll do what you want me to do. You're a vampire, I'm a vampire too. You're a vampire, I'm a vampire too.
You've got to mention...
Oh, you didn't mention the bloody sonic screwdriver, did you?
Are you worried people are going to write in? That's,
yeah, I'm concerned that
We're hoping people will write in.
Because I really,
They'll do it in that voice.
They'll do it in that
voice. Leave us an iTunes review. They never mention the sonic screwdriver.
Oh, you didn't mention the fact that the face had gills and things.